welcome to Mental Health Matters. I'm Barbara Myers. On today's show, we're going to be focusing on the experience of grief. Grief is something that almost everyone experiences at some point in their life. In this show, we'll be talking about what it is and how you can help yourself and others who are going through a difficult time grieving. We're very pleased and honored to have with us 3 guests, all associated with Crisis Support Services of Alameda County. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nancy Fuller-Hebel, who is a licensed clinical psychologist, and she works with people who are grieving. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Leah Moreno, who is an art therapist and an intern at Crisis Support Services and has also lived with grief in her life. Welcome.
Thank you.
Next, we have Anna Lazo, who is an intern also at Crisis Support Services, and she helps run grief support services. Welcome, Anna. What I'd like to start with is sort of a definition of what we're talking about. So I'll start with you, Nancy. Can you tell me what grief is?
Yes, grief is a natural response that people have when they lose someone or something to whom they are attached. And when we think about attachment is that bond between 2 people that is very strong and enduring over time. So that the degree of attachment will really determine the kind and depth of the mourning or grieving that they will be experiencing.
Can you give some examples of situations where grief happens?
Most usually we think of grief when we think of the loss of a family member or a loved one, a friend, someone in the community. Beyond that, however, you grieve if you have lost a job, certainly if you've lost a beloved pet, if you've lost a dream of something that you thought would happen in your life, but for reasons beyond your control, it simply is not going to happen.
What kinds of reactions do people have when they're experiencing grief?
Well, emotionally, we all are familiar with the feeling of deep sadness, intense sadness, and tearfulness, and oftentimes, initially, with anger as well, emotionally. From a physical standpoint, there's oftentimes a loss of appetite, difficulty sleeping, a feeling of not really being connected to where you are, what time of day it is, what day of the week it even is. Socially, it's hard for people who are in the midst of grief to be in social environments. And from an existential perspective, there's a questioning of how could this possibly have happened? How could a supreme being allow this to happen?
Is it necessary for people to grieve and mourn to get over a loss? Yes,
it really is necessary. Without grieving, without mourning, we don't have a process to go through that allows us to reinvest ourselves in our lives. It's reestablishing an equilibrium, if you will. Without grief, without mourning, people can have what we call unresolved grief, and that can sometimes look like depression. At other times, people become just stuck in the moment in time that their loss occurred, and they're not really able to, as I said a moment ago, reinvest themselves and become hopeful.
There's been some people that have proposed that there are different stages that people go through when they grieve. Some say it's a roller coaster rather than a set of stages. Do you find this to be a helpful concept?
I do. I find it helpful for people who are grieving. I also find it helpful for people who are supporting the person who's grieving, and also for mental health professionals as well.
And what stages do you see?
Well, we're all familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages. I find that there are 4 distinct stages that are helpful, and the first stage is one of accepting the reality of the loss. And that's where the mourner goes through the roller coaster that you just mentioned. There's a tendency to vacillate between behaving rationally at times and irrationally at others. This is when there's complete disbelief. I can't believe this is happening to me. A great deal of tearfulness. Kind of a deja vu, people will describe, that the loved one will walk through the door, or someone with a beloved pet will talk about hearing the pet in the other part of the house. It's just a period when people can't believe what's happening. And supporters are oftentimes in the same state of disbelief as well. But it can't be underscored enough how important a person's presence is, for just to be there emotionally and to be there to listen to the person who's just had the loss. The second stage is what we call the working through the pain. And this is where the pain of the grief becomes extremely intense. And some people describe it as a literal physical pain that accompanies the emotional and behavioral pain. The mourner's task at this point is to tolerate these intense feelings and not try to run away from them. It's a temptation not to feel these kinds of intense feelings. If someone starts to run away, they may use more alcohol or some drugs. They may engage in behavior that takes them away from their feelings. And if that happens, they run the risk of unresolved grief. So it's difficult for the supporters to watch this because they're seeing their loved one on this roller coaster ride. But it's also very important to remember that grieving is a process. It's not a stage, and the intensity of it will end in time. So the supporters can help by being no judgment, no, it's time to get over it, either overtly or otherwise, to listen, and also to begin to ask the question, what can I do to help you? To engage that person who's mourning and in such intense pain, what can I do to help? The third stage is adjusting to a life without the other, or without the dream, or without the job. And that's usually taking stock of what was the role of the other. And for example, for a spouse, perhaps their spouse took care of the money matters or took care of maintenance in the house. If it's someone that you're not living with, what was it that, what kind of psychic space, if you will, did this person consume? And so how am I going to go on without them? And so in this stage, the supporters can be very helpful by being more proactive, helping the mourner in terms of go to the bank with them if that's what they need to do, or go to Home Depot, or find the plumber. Help the mourner talk through what's happening and how they can help. And again, engage that conversation and what can I do to help you, so that the mourner can feel as if, they're regaining a sense of control, and they can think and talk this through. The final stage is emotionally relocating the loss. And I want to stress that this is not about forgetting the other. It's really about learning to live with this loss, and this is an important piece to know that no one gives up. It's just relocating that person or that dream in your emotional life, or that position, that job.
Oh, thank you. That's really helpful. When does grief become complicated or unresolved, as you said?
Yes. It's a good question, Barbara. The literature is not completely clear. They would say 3 to 6 months, but we have to keep in mind that different losses are going to have different trajectories of grief, of course.
So it's 3 to 6 months when you're still not pulling out of it?
Exactly. When we would call it acute.
Yeah.
When the person would appear to be stuck.
Yeah.
Perhaps they are losing interest in anything around them. They can't accept help, or they're not asking for help. They may have a hard time getting out of bed, and they're not taking care of their hygiene. These are symptoms of depression, and so at that point, supporters would want to come to them, talk to them as much as they can. If the mourner's not really receptive, then you would want to reach out to other family members, reach out to people in the community, members of the clergy, professionals, therapists, and kind of figure out how, as a group, no one's alone, you know, how as a group you can help this mourner get over this hump.
I'd like to have Anna help us to understand when a person is grieving and having difficulty and maybe even having unresolved or complicated grief. I know there are grief programs and grief support groups that are supported. I'd like to ask you about what some of the programs that there are at Crisis Support Services and some of the ones that you're involved in facilitating.
At Crisis Support Services, we have the Grief Counseling Project, and through the Grief Counseling Project, we have individualized grief counseling, and as well as the groups, which I'd like to talk a little bit about, because I'm running one of them, or facilitating the Survivors of Suicide group, and the other group we've had is the Homicide Bereavement group.
And why is it that you have special groups for suicide and homicide and other kinds of grief?
Sure. Homicide and suicide are both sudden and traumatic and stigmatized losses. And bereavement following these kinds of losses can become complicated grief, in which the symptoms or the experience of the grief can be much more intense and can last for a much longer period of time. Survivors of homicide, or people who have lost loved ones to homicide, can often feel very vulnerable and angry and violated, and their sense of the world as a safe place often crumbles after their loss. And survivors of suicide often deal with a tremendous amount of guilt because they're often blaming themselves and are also dealing with, can often deal with conflicted feelings about feeling angry or being angry with the person who they've lost. So in both these cases, the sense of isolation and vulnerability, I think, is really what makes these kinds of groups so necessary. And in these groups, it really provides a place for people to come and speak openly about their experience and their loss, particularly with suicide, which is a stigmatized loss. The bereaved may not feel comfortable talking about their kind of loss or about their loved one.
Right.
So in a group like this, they can often feel much more comfortable to talk with people who have gone through similar kinds of losses.
If someone wanted to join one of these groups, how would they go about doing it? Would they contact Crisis Support Services?
Exactly. Contact Crisis
And
Support
then say
Services.
that they had a loss and that they were interested in joining a group, and then you'd help them figure out which group would be the right one.
Exactly.
And then they would join. And then what does it consist of, or what happens in a group?
Sure. Our groups run for 10 sessions, 10 weeks long, and they meet once a week. And we like to keep them small and have closed membership, meaning, so we're looking at from 4 to 8 people, and we keep the same members throughout from the beginning to the end. And it's a place where people share what happened and who they lost and talk about their loss and really try to go through the grieving process together. And it's a place where the grief experience can be normalized because they're with others who are experiencing many of similar things. As well, it's a place to get education and support about their loss and just grieving in general. It's a place where they can learn from each other and from each other's experience. But I also think it's very healing to be able to be of help and support to others.
Yes, I've been a member of support groups before, and I know that many times I get as much as I give, you know, in those kinds of situations. There's a facilitator like you that makes sure that everybody gets a chance to speak and that the right issues are being addressed and that kind of thing.
That's exactly how it's run.
Okay. Oh, good. Is there anything else that you'd like to share?
You know, there is one other service we provide, which is debriefing, which I'm not sure if you wanted to talk a little bit about debriefing
Yeah.
after a crisis. I think, Nancy, you had more information about debriefing.
Sure. It's a service that we offer in the community. If there's something traumatic that's happened we think of it in a school shooting, for example, or in a company where there's been a traumatic event that's happened, then a group of people from crisis support services goes to that facility and basically offers the people there an opportunity to process what they have seen, because we know that the sooner the intervention, the better the outcome. So that's a service that we offer in the community, and anyone who needs it calls crisis support services, and then whoever is available in terms of professionals and interns will go to that particular location.
If you sort of debrief someone right after, get to tell their story right after the event, that somehow keeps it from becoming
going
a
inside
real
of
big
them.
problem for them in the future.
Yes, there's still a process involved,
Right.
of course,
Yeah.
but what we do is we hope to mediate any kind of symptoms that might come from the witnessing of something that's been traumatic. And of
Right.
course, we think of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we can offer this service, and if the person feels that, or we feel that their trauma is being activated, if they've had previous traumas, the chances are that it'll be a little bit more serious for them because they're more vulnerable, then we can offer referrals for them, and it's a way of, again, participating in the community.
Well, good. Leah, I'd like to ask a question. Every time you grieve, is it unique to a person or unique with each death?
Because our relationships are very unique in themselves, the grief and loss, the experience can be very unique. So, for instance, the loss of, for instance, my grandmother is very different than the loss of my brother. However, with each loss, there's also everyone is going to grieve differently. So another thing to take into consideration is also the developmental understanding of death. So we have a child might grieve one way, and an adolescent might understand it differently, and so and also an adult might understand it differently. So we have to take into consideration the understanding and maybe tailor some of the grieving.
When do we know that grieving has come to a natural completion?
Such a good question. Thank you for asking it, Barbara. You know, it's, again, as I said earlier, it's a process, not a state. And I think people who are oftentimes in the grieving process become overwhelmed and feel overwhelmed and fearful that it will never end. But it does. And we know that it ends when the mourner is able to reinvest in their lives. They are able to be hopeful about their future. They can think of the loss without intense feelings of being overwhelmed, of feeling tearful and intensely sad. They'll certainly feel sad, but it doesn't have the same kind of intensity.
It doesn't keep them from doing what they want to do with it.
That's exactly right, and that's the reinvesting part, you know, reinvesting in self as well as reinvesting in others. When the person can experience gratification and adapt to new roles, you know, that's the reinvesting in self and other. And again, I really would want to stress that the loss is never forgotten. You know, it's never forgotten, but rather it's honored and it's cherished. And the loss doesn't drive the person's thoughts so much anymore, but rather it becomes a part of them as a whole.
Leah, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about your own experience of grief, and could you tell us about the circumstances of your loss and what happened?
Well, I remember getting a call in the middle of the night that there had been an accident, and that my brother was killed in the accident.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
And it was, speaking of the different feelings, it was a complete veil of fog that comes over, and shock. I think I was driven by shock for the next couple of days. And also just confusion, kind of standing at your door with the keys in your hand. So, you know, it's can really put yes, it's a fog that pretty much you find yourself in.
After the couple of days that you were in the fog, then what happened after that? I guess were you involved in preparing for the memorial service or the funeral or anything?
Yes. I think that's what pretty much took me through that, was the shock. I found it really helpful, though. Our family bonded together, really came together. There was a lot of support. There was just a lot of emotions going around, a lot of confusion. After a while, I think 3 months later, I sought professional help, a grieving counselor, to kind of have a safe place to go ahead and release a lot of that. And I found that, you know, she let me know that these were normal experiences, and that I wasn't alone, which, you know, when you're kind of standing there, sometimes you're like, wow, how is this happening? How are people functioning? And so it was really quite a comfort to hear.
What is it that gave you hope when you were going through this? Was it the therapy and learning that you were not alone, or?
Yes, the counseling, and also just having a connection with friends and family, being able to kind of say, I'm hurting right now, and to be also able to say, I miss him right now. It was nice to have that witnessed. And
sometimes I think people think that they're being kind by not mentioning the person's name, when really you need to say the person's name. Is about, I'm still missing my brother.
Yeah, so that was the hope that got me through, was also being with family and friends.
And what keeps you on an even keel now?
Within my journey through this, unique journey through this, I found doing creative work, poetry, drawing, sculpture, painting, as much as I can do creatively for myself, and also to still have the open connection with family and friends.
Can you tell us why art therapy is particularly helpful for someone in grief?
Through the process of art making, the art becomes a communication tool, and it really helps, especially in the fatigue that one might feel in a grieving process, where words just sometimes are hard to come by or hard to pull. So this is a very non-threatening way to communicate.
Do you just tell people to draw whatever they feel like drawing, or do you have specific things that you ask them to do?
Because it's such a unique process for each individual, I mean...
it sort of depends on the situation.
It really does. However, sometimes it can be just, you know, maybe create for me as something that shows how you're feeling, and in others it might be a directive of like, show me a happy day that you two share together, or something. And that way, that the art can do several things. It can contain some of the confusing emotions. It can also externalize some of the emotions, and also kind of forming a visual aid for both a counselor and the bereaved or mourning individual. And so you can kind of, you know, figure out how you're going to move around, and it can tailor the therapeutic experience. And then there's a memorializing aspect to it, that you could actually spend a little time with your memories with the person.
I'm glad that the county has something like this. I'd like to now ask those of you who are watching the show, I'd like to give you a challenge. Do you know someone who is living with grief, intense grief right now? Maybe it's someone that you know, or maybe it's you. Can you think now of how you can understand that experience and you can be supportive of them or supportive of yourself? What can you suggest? What can you do to help? Nancy's given us a lot of good ideas at various different stages of grief, and we have examples of various groups and therapies and so forth that are helpful. I'd like to give you the assignment of thinking about what could help in that kind of situation. I'd like to give you some resources and organizations for those of you who are watching. All three of our guests are from Crisis Support Services of Alameda County. They have grief and senior counseling programs, and their phone number is 1-800-260-0094. The suicide hotline is 1-800-309-3121. There are several organizations that have presence on the internet that can be helpful. One is the Compassionate Friends, which is for bereaved parents, people who've lost children. Another is the Grief Recovery Institute. And finally, for suicide, the American Association of Suicidology, which runs a number of support groups throughout the country and has a lot of information on the internet. I'd like to thank you, Nancy, Leah, Anna, for being here.
Thank you.
And I'll end with these closing words. Take courage, friends. The way is often hard. The path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down there is another truth. You are not alone. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.